Hello, everyone. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. It is my pleasure to introduce today's program, The Forgotten Life of Herschel Grynszpan. Joining us today are Alan E. Steinweis and Jonathan Kirsch. Alan, who is an expert on Kristallnacht, is a professor of history and the Raul Hilberg Distinguished Professor of Holocaust Studies at the University of Vermont. He is the author of 4 books, including Studying the Jew, Scholarly Anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany, and most relevant to today, Kristallnacht 1938. Professor Steinweis has been a Fulbright professor at the University of Heidelberg, a visiting professor at the University of Frankfurt and the University of Munich, and in 2018, he was the Levine Senior Invitational Scholar at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Jonathan is a publishing and intellectual property attorney based in Los Angeles. He has written 13 books, including The Harlot by the Side of the Road, and most importantly for our purposes, The Short, Strange Life of Herschel Grynszpan, A Boy Avenger, a Nazi Diplomat, and a Murder in Paris. Jonathan is the book editor of the Jewish Journal and a book reviewer for the Washington Post. During the program, please feel free to share questions in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can during the hour. This program is being recorded and the video will be available tomorrow on the museum's YouTube channel. So now I would like to welcome both Alan and Jonathan.
Happy to be with you.
Yeah, thank you so much, both of you, for being here.
Greetings.
So to start out, Alan, I would like you to, if you wouldn't mind, telling us about the background of Kristallnacht and sort of what we should know to better understand Grynszpan's story.
Yeah, so of course, the Kristallnacht was a momentous event in the history of the persecution of Jews in Nazi Germany leading up to the Holocaust. It's hard to boil down to a very brief synopsis, but I'll do my best and just kind of in bullet point fashion. First, I would observe that it was the only large-scale incidence of violence against Jews in Germany before the war. Previously, anti-Jewish measures in Nazi Germany had a primarily legal and bureaucratic quality. There had been sporadic violence or brief waves of violence in certain municipalities, but there was nothing even remotely approaching anything like the Kristallnacht before the war. Second, just to review some of the damage, most of the country's synagogues were either destroyed or severely damaged in the Kristallnacht. Thousands of Jewish-owned shops were vandalized and plundered. Many Jewish institutions were attacked, schools, hospitals, retirement homes, and also many Jewish homes were invaded. People just broke into homes and apartments and, terrorized and beat up the inhabitants. In the collective memory of the Kristallnacht, the images that tend to predominate are those of burning synagogues and the broken shop windows that created the crystal-like, pieces of glass on the sidewalk from which the event takes its name, the night of broken glass. And we tend to overlook the attacks on Jews in their homes. The official death toll of the Kristallnacht was 91, but that was an official count by the German police apparatus. The real number was probably several hundred, especially if you include the suicides and the deaths of Jews who were arrested in the days after the Kristallnacht and sent off to concentration camps. A point that's important to know is that the Kristallnacht was not planned in advance. It was only organized a few hours before it actually began. Well, it was planned in advance, but only a few hours in advance, right? It wasn't something that had been planned, for weeks in advance and then executed. It was organized only a few hours in advance. Hitler only gave his personal approval in a meeting with the propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, on that very day, on November 9th. Of course, the pretext was for that decision and for unleashing the violence was the death on November 9th of the German diplomat Ernst from Rath, who had been shot in Paris on November 7th by Herschel Grynszpan. And I won't say more about Grynszpan because Jonathan is the expert on that subject. A further point, a very wide spectrum of Germans participated in the anti-Jewish violence of the Kristallnacht. The stormtroopers, the SA, was at the core of the violence, but there were also many participants from the Hitler Youth, mainly teenage boys, and many ordinary Germans, including the neighbors of the Jews whose homes or businesses were being attacked, kind of joined into the violence spontaneously. The other side of that coin was that there were also quite a few instances of Jews receiving help from non-Jewish friends and neighbors, help in the form of providing shelter, hiding them, sometimes defending them from physical assault, trying to scold the attackers, and then after the Kristallnacht, helping their Jewish friends and neighbors clean up the damage that had been done. Turning to the Jews themselves, it's important for people to realize that they did not remain passive. Many defended themselves insofar as that was possible. And of course, vastly outnumbered, in many cases, old people were not in a position to mount an effective defense about against what was being done to them. But many did kind of like actively hide, actively ran away. When they were being hit, they tried to hit back, if it was possible, and so forth. We just need to kind of get away from this notion that the Jewish victims of these kinds of events just took what was coming to them or what was directed at them. One point that I try to emphasize in my book is that the Kristallnacht, or Night of Broken Glass, was really not a night. That the common designation emphasizing that this was a night is really kind of historically very misleading, because it was really a prolonged event. The violence really began already in certain localities on the 7th of November, in the hours during which the Nazi propaganda machine was drumming up anti-Jewish sentiment after the shooting in Paris, the shooting by Herschel Grynszpan. That violence continued on the 8th of November. The 9th of November, the night of the 9th to the 10th of November, was a kind of a crescendo of this wave of violence that had begun earlier in the week. After daylight on November 10th, the violence continued, well into the day. So, sometimes we imagine that the violence kind of unfolded under cover of darkness, but in many places it happened in broad daylight. And then you have this wave of mass arrests that ensued beginning on the 10th of November and continuing for a few days, which resulted in about 30,000 Jewish men being arrested and sent to several concentration camps, where many of them spent weeks or even months before their eventual release. And of course, in the camps, they experienced terror. So, in the testimonies of Jews who went through the Kristallnacht, testimonies that I studied for my book, it became very clear that in their lived experience, the Kristallnacht was a sustained nightmare of days or even weeks in the cases of the men in the camps. It wasn't just one really traumatic night. The final point I want to make is that the Kristallnacht is often thought of or referred to as the beginning of the Holocaust or a prelude to the Holocaust. And, that's an understandable view, and I don't necessarily object to that terminology, but I just want to point out that the history is really somewhat complicated, because in important ways, the Kristallnacht was really a break from the general, or a break in the general pattern that had been of anti-Jewish persecution that began in 1933 and then continued after November 1938. The primary strategy for excluding Jews from German society starting in 1933 had been legal and bureaucratic. There was, as I said earlier, sporadic, localized violence, and I don't want to minimize the importance of that. But the Kristallnacht really was a kind of a deviation from that pattern. And after the Kristallnacht, the Nazi leadership came to understand that that violence, the chaos on the streets, the destruction of property and so forth, had been widely criticized in German society, including in elite circles, in the diplomatic corps, and the military officer corps, in the civil service. People realized that it had done damage to German foreign policy. So after the Kristallnacht, the Nazi leadership made a point to return to the more systematic form of kind of legal, bureaucratic, exclusionary practices that had pertained really, before the Kristallnacht as well. So it was a return to kind of like a more orderly form of persecution. So yes, the Kristallnacht was a kind of a prelude or beginning of the terrible things that happened later, in as much as it was this kind of incredible outburst of violence. But when you look at the longer continuity of Nazi anti-Jewish policy, it stands out really for being exceptional rather than typical. So I'll leave it there. Certainly we can talk more about these issues in the discussion later.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. So Alan mentioned that on November 7th, 1938, Herschel Grynszpan assassinates a Nazi diplomat in Paris. So Jonathan, can you give us a bit of background about Herschel and sort of what his life was like and kind of what led up to this assassination?
Be happy to do that. I want to start by saying, when I went to Yad Vashem with my wife to doing archival research for the book I wrote, we went through the public gallery of the exhibits, and the exhibit for Kristallnacht had a film running, and significantly, there was a microsecond when the picture of Herschel Grynszpan and his name were spoken, but it lasted a microsecond. He was acknowledged and then passed on. That's the fate he has suffered as a historical figure. He's been almost entirely overlooked. There's an irony to that, as we'll have an occasion to talk about, because in his own lifetime, he was world famous. He was a world celebrity. He was born in Germany to Polish Jewish parents, and he came of age at a time when the events that Alan has described were beginning to occur. The exclusion of Jews from the social life and the business life, the educational life of Germany. So the Grynszpan family, like all the other Jews of Germany, both immigrant Jews from Poland, which is true of the Grynszpans, or native-born Jews, were under tremendous pressure and deprivation and even physical threat. So the Grynszpan family, which is quite a large family, contrived to smuggle Herschel out of Germany. He went first to an uncle in Essen. It was a big family. Then he went to an uncle in Belgium, in Brussels. Then he smuggled himself at the age of 15 across the border into France, where he went to live with yet another uncle. And so he was living in Paris, essentially as a stateless person, when Hitler took a very grave step by escalating the war against the Jews, by arresting and deporting 12,000 Polish Jews living in Germany and taking them to the Polish border and forcing them across the border. He wanted to get rid of his Jews. He wanted to reduce the Jewish population of Germany. And here were 12,000 non-citizens that would be repatriated to Poland. The Polish frontier guards saw these Jews approaching the border and turned them back. And so they were caught in a no man's land and unable to go back into Germany, unable to move forward into Poland. And this itself became a world event, a media event. And Herschel, by now 17, living in Paris, was aware of the plight of these Jews. And among these Jews was his mother and father, and his older sister and his older brother. Here we begin to see the personality of Herschel Grynszpan, which plays such an important part in the history. He was a very emotional, high-strung, impulsive young man. He had emotions he could not control. He was tortured by the plight of his relatives in custody. Now, they were eventually granted admission into Poland, and they were put in a refugee camp. And his sister wrote a very heartrending postcard from the camp about their plight. And at that point, Herschel Grynszpan, remarkably, again, at the age of 17, decided to do something about this atrocity. And what he did was get up one morning, go to a gun store, purchase a pistol. The price tag was still on the trigger guard when he took this gun, concealed this gun in his coat, and went to the German embassy in Paris, told the guard that he had some important documents and he needed to see a member of the consulate staff or the ambassador himself. And he was faithfully ushered into the office of Ernst von Rath, who was actually a very low-ranking third secretary. And according to the story that comes down to us, von Rath says to this slight, short, anguished-looking Jewish boy, 17, so show me your important papers. And he replied, here in the name of the 12,000 Jews are your papers. And he took out of his pocket his gun with the price tag hanging from the trigger guard, and he fired all 5 shots at von Rath, and thus wrote himself into the pages of history as in his own mind, an avenger of the Jewish people and a person who was willing to take it upon himself to call attention to an atrocity that the rest of the world was ignoring. That's the beginning, just the beginning of what the title of my book characterizes as the short, strange life of Herschel Grynszpan.
Yeah, we will definitely get into more of what happened to him. But before we sort of get further in Grynszpan's story, was this assassination sort of publicized immediately afterwards? And what was sort of the press reaction to it? And how was that all tying into?
It was a media sensation in the term, in the context of the time. It was a headline story. It was on the radio. It was known all over the world. And part of the reason was, as Alan has already indicated, the Nazis themselves propagandized on the shooting. They made it a big story themselves because in their eyes, this was the international Jewish conspiracy at work, and this insignificant, friendless 17-year-old boy was actually the active agent of a world conspiracy aimed at Nazi Germany. So between the outrage and vilification campaign of the Nazis and the shock and horror of the Jewish community, who felt very endangered by this, and the concern that was expressed in American media, that's a very significant aspect of this story, he became a world celebrity. He was immediately arrested, placed in custody by the French police. He never really emerged from custody the rest of his life. And he was under arrest and awaiting trial for years. But from the moment that the shooting took place, he was a world celebrity. Which is ironic because today he's entirely obscure and almost completely forgotten. And there are reasons for that. There are reasons why he was an uncomfortable figure.
One can very easily trace the systematic nature of the vilification of Grynszpan and the kind of trying to show him as part of a world Jewish conspiracy. And this is very easily seen in this kind of really, when historians work on, on a topic, sometimes they just kind of like stumble onto a source and they can't believe their luck that the propaganda ministry would send out daily, multiple times daily, on a kind of a newswire, the instructions to newspapers all over Germany, how they should cover certain events. And the complete printout of this newswire is available, and you can actually kind of like, just read it almost minute by minute, seeing how they're instructing newspapers in Germany to cover this. And this went out over the radio as well. And therefore, it was, so the shooting happened on the morning of November 7th, which was a Monday morning. And that evening already in Germany, you had the first anti-Jewish riots in the city of Kassel in north central Germany.
I can set the stage for something that I believe Alan is going to take the laboring oar on. And a question just came in. Why didn't the Nazis kill Grynszpan when they invaded France in 1940? And the answer was they wanted to use Grynszpan for a massive show trial to validate their conspiracy theory about the Jews. So he was a very valuable prisoner in their eyes. I want to give you the first part of this story. He was first, for a couple of years, under investigation by the French authorities who had him in custody and were going to put him on trial. A very famous a media figure from the 40s. Her name was Dorothy Thompson. She was a syndicated columnist, a broadcaster. She took up the case, the Grynszpan case, and became his champion. And she did it in a very interesting way. The Jews of France completely disowned him. They were terrified and horror-stricken by the danger that this represented to them. There was an open letter published in a Jewish newspaper in Paris addressed to the victim's mother, apologizing and expressing condolences to von Rath's mother and disassociating themselves from Grynszpan. Dorothy Thompson understood this, and she started what you call the Journalist Defense Fund to pay for the legal defense of Grynszpan in the French courts. And she said in her broadcast, this is a Christian duty. We won't even accept donations from Jewish donors because this exposes them to danger in Nazi Germany and in the eyes of the Germans. So it was very high-minded on her part. And her fund was able to secure the services of a French lawyer who was what we would call a cause lawyer. He was a celebrity lawyer. He took cases that had high publicity value. We have lawyers like that here in the United States. And his theory of defense, this is where the Grynszpan story takes its strangest turn. He began to realize that if he went into a French courtroom, this is before war had broken out, and tried to put Hitler in the defendant's box, as the phrase went, put Hitler on trial, that the French, seeking to avoid provocation with Germany and frightened of a war with Germany, they would not acquit. So he came up with a theory of the case, which he suggested to Grynszpan himself. What if he asks, in a kind of a leading way, this was actually an affair of the heart? What if this was a crime of passion? What if you and von Rath were homosexual lovers? And there were several different variants of the story that he extracted sexual favors from Grynszpan by promising to get his parents out of Poland. He offered to pay Grynszpan and reneged on the payment. And what if you went to the embassy on that day to take revenge against him for this sexual predation against you? Then it would depoliticize the case and allow a jury or a judge to acquit you of this crime without provoking animosity with Germany. At least that was his theory of the case. At that point in time, Grynszpan said to his attorney, that's not what happened. I will not say that in court. I did this for higher purposes. And his lawyer was kind of disgusted with him, thought he was a foolish boy because he wouldn't take this line of defense when it was offered to him. Now, this story will resurface again, not in France, but in Germany. And I believe that Alan's going to take that part of the story. But I'll conclude by saying, while in custody in France, no one felt more empowered and privileged than Grynszpan himself. He would sit in his prison cell and write letters to Roosevelt, to Hitler. He knew he was famous. He was playing on his moment of fame. Then when the war, when the invasion of France by Germany, which followed the outbreak of the war by a year or so, and everything went into chaos in France, there was a great event called l'Exode, the Exodus, where the French were fleeing from the fighting in the northern part of the country. And he was able to escape, or he was released from custody by his jailers. Once the Nazis came into France, he was on a wanted list because of their goal of putting him on trial back in Germany. After a kind of a comedy of errors, he was eventually found and arrested and flown back to Berlin. And that's where the second half of the Grynszpan story takes place.
So I could pick up there. And actually, one interesting footnote here is that when Grynszpan was transferred by France to Germany, the Germans didn't simply arrest him and take him. There was an extradition a process that was executed formally. The French insisted on that because it was important for Vichy to show that despite everything, it was still an independent country, and it was engaging in a voluntary extradition of a criminal suspect and not just letting the Germans, kidnap someone. So they take him to Berlin and interrogate him. He spent some time in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp outside of Berlin. And the propaganda ministry, in conjunction with the German Foreign Office, the Foreign Ministry, plans an elaborate week-long show trial of Grynszpan, and the documentation containing the orchestration for that trial has survived in the archives of the German Foreign Ministry. So we can see in detail what they were trying to accomplish. And what they planned on doing was demonstrating that Grynszpan had simply been kind of, he was a 17-year-old teenager at the time of the shooting in Paris. So they could hardly argue that he was the mastermind of all this. So the idea was to show that he was really kind of a tool or a pawn of world Jewry or international Jewry, and the specific purpose of the assassination in November 1938 would have been, according to this theory that would have been presented at the show trial, was the specific purpose of the assassination was to drive a wedge between Germany and France. It's important to remember that the assassination and the Kristallnacht subsequently all happened just a few weeks after the Munich conference, right? And so there was a great deal, the First World War was still a very fresh memory in the minds of many Europeans. There were a lot of people in France who didn't want to go to war with Germany again. And so French politicians and the French public was very divided about how to deal with Germany at the time. So what the Germans wanted to show in the Grynszpan trial was that world Jewry used the assassination of the diplomat in order to basically kind of provoke a fight between Germany and France, that it looked, it seemed as though France was going to have a rapprochement with the Germans, and that world Jewry was trying to disrupt that. For the trial, they organized a number of very prominent people who would have been kind of expert witnesses. One of them, Gerhard Kittel, was a professor of New Testament at the University of Tübingen, one of the great New Testament scholars of the 20th century, who had for much of his life been a kind of a philo-Semite before he turned into an anti-Semite. That's a kind of story unto itself. And he was going to testify about how the Talmud permits Jews to murder Gentiles when it serves the interests of the Jews, just for example. Friedrich Schoenemann, a prominent professor of American history who had spent time like as a guest professor at Harvard earlier and so forth. He was lined up to testify about how the government of Franklin Roosevelt in the United States was kind of, in the control of the Jews on Wall Street and, that kind of thing. And of course, that's an old anti-Semitic trope from the 1930s about, the Jew deal and all of that. They even lined up Georges Bonnet, who had been the foreign minister of France in 1938. And he was going to testify how the Germans and the French were working, the French and the Germans together were working very hard to kind of mend fences when the Jews interfered and tried to break things up through this assassination. That, of course, the trial never came to pass. And just to pick up the thread about Grynszpan again, so one has to ask, why did the trial never come to pass? One reason had to do with the Vichy government wasn't crazy about the idea, and we can kind of bracket that out for the moment. That's very complicated. But Grynszpan took the initiative in the situation, and ironically, now kind of reversed this. As Jonathan said, when his lawyer in Paris had originally suggested that he testified that he had been involved in a homosexual relationship with his victim, and Grynszpan had rejected that out of hand. But now Grynszpan had the presence of mind, as a 20 or 21-year-old, this is like 1941, 1942 that this is taking place. He now, he realized that this would be potentially a way to torpedo the trial. So he begins to tell the Germans that he indeed was involved with Ernst von Rath, his German victim, in a homosexual relationship. And the architects of the trial started worrying, what would happen if they actually put Grynszpan on the stand. If they couldn't put him on the stand, it wouldn't be a very effective show trial. They had to put him on the stand, and they saw him as a kind of a loose cannon, that he would basically testify that he was involved in a gay, that a German diplomat in Paris, who, it's important to point out that Ernst von Rath, this diplomat who Grynszpan had killed, in the interim had been kind of turned into a martyr by German propaganda. And then if Grynszpan, publicly disclosed that he had been gay, this would have, not fit the script, so to speak. And so Goebbels and Hitler made the decision personally. They decided not to follow through with the trial. And of course, once the show trial was taken off the table, then Grynszpan was no longer indispensable. And I guess Jonathan could explain the circumstances or the purported circumstances of his death.
Yeah, let me follow up on that. First of all, I want to point out, because it's another measure of Grynszpan's notoriety or fame, is that when he first came into Nazi custody, Eichmann himself was sent into his cell to interrogate him. He was considered to be a prize prisoner, an important prisoner. But what we find out, if there was ever any question that Nazi Germany was run by Adolf Hitler personally, that he personally made decisions. There's a lot of talk around the subject of the Holocaust that there's no document with Hitler's fingerprints or signature on it that orders the mass murder of the Jews. This is sometimes bandied about. When the bureaucrats who were in charge of the show trial learned that the evidence might go off the rails, they sent what we would call a CYA memo, and it was on a form called a Führerinformation. This is like a standard form for sending a message to Hitler himself. And they informed him that this evidence might come out at the trial, and what did he want to do about it? No one wanted to take the responsibility for canceling the trial without Hitler's approval, and nobody wanted to take the responsibility for going forward with the trial at risk of these disclosures without Hitler's approval. And so Hitler said, the trial is postponed, not canceled, but postponed. And that probably saved Grynszpan's life for a while. Just as nobody wanted to go forward with the trial without Hitler's approval, nobody wanted to be the one who put a bullet into Grynszpan's head. And then when Hitler decided to go back with the trial, they would have to tell him, we don't have that young man anymore. So he was probably kept in prison right up till the end of the war. We don't have a definitive date for his death, but there are various theories about it. And one of the theories is that at the very end of the war, when the defeat of Germany was obvious, there was a lot of revenge taking and score settling, and people who had been kept alive for one reason or another were taken out and shot. And that's probably the fate of Herschel Grynszpan. There's a poignant fact in the record, which is that since we don't know his date of death or circumstances of death, he's given the legal death date of May 8th, 1945. And this is true for many Holocaust victims whose dates and circumstances of death are not known. May 8th was Victory in Europe Day, was the day when Nazi Germany was finally defeated. And just to add a little intriguing postscript, many years later, there was a trial in a West German court, 1960. It was a libel trial brought by the von Rath family against a reporter who had reprised this story, including the homosexuality aspect of it. And they sued for libel. They brought a case for libel against the reporter for accusing their long dead relative of being homosexual. And one of the lawyers in that case said, the judge had observed, if only Grynszpan were here to testify. And it might have been the actual defendant said, why, he was here. He was in courtroom yesterday. He could be, you could serve him with a subpoena and compel him to testify. And this was a fiction, a fantasy, but it introduced into history the notion that somehow miraculously he survived, and some spectral version of Herschel Grynszpan was in this very courtroom as late as 1960. Like so much else in the Grynszpan story, it reads like fiction, it reads like invention, and there's a lot at the end of the day that we can't know with absolute certainty.
You know, there's a prominent German historian of international relations, Hans-Jürgen Doscher, who 15 years or so ago published a book, not exclusively on this subject, but which dealt with it extensively. And he actually found some evidence in the personnel folder of Ernst von Rath in the German diplomatic archive, suggesting that von Rath actually was gay or had been gay.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that there was a relationship between von Rath and Grynszpan. I mean, what's entirely possible is that when, and maybe Jonathan can note this, can talk to this, speak to this, when Grynszpan's lawyer in Paris was investigating the case, he may have done, or his people may have investigated the background of the victim And they discovered that particular fact just by kind of talking to people kind of in the scene there. And that may have given, was his name Joffre?
Yeah.
That may have given him the idea of suggesting that to Herschel Grynszpan as a motive.
Yeah, and we should pause and note that I don't want to go too close to stereotypes, but people perceived Grynszpan as a plausible, perceived it to be plausible that he was gay by certain kind of externals. He was a natty dresser. He was very careful about his appearance. He was delicate in size. He lisped. He was somewhat frail. I mean, these fit stereotypes, and I don't want to, traffic in stereotypes. There was also some evidence that von Rath may have been treated for disease, sexual disease, and so the whole theory may, in fact, be rooted in reality. But what's unmistakable is that if we ask ourselves, why has Grynszpan not been celebrated as a hero of the Jewish people? No question, one reason is the overlay of homosexuality, which was uncomfortable in the 40s and the 50s, and for some people, I fear, is still uncomfortable. Alan, I'd like to ask a question that occurred to me during your initial talk. Clearly, there was a point at which the Nazis had the goal of getting Jews out of Germany. And part of the Grynszpan story is how hard it was for them to get rid of their Jews. And then another part of the story is that they realized that solving the Jewish problems in the streets of German cities was unacceptable because it caused too much chaos and damage. But when do you think the decision was made to take the final solution, the solution of keeping the Jews and executing them?
Well, that particular question has been the focus of a great deal of, very meticulous archival research by a number of scholars working in the field. It's not something that I myself have worked on, although I've read this material. There are, and I teach it. There are differences of opinion. Usually, they all converge. The various opinions all converge on the year 1941. But some will place it earlier in 1941, like on the eve of the invasion of the Soviet Union, when the Einsatzgruppen were being formed to go in behind the Wehrmacht and start shooting Jews in the Soviet Union. Others have posited a kind of a two-step final solution decision in which an initial decision was made to murder the Jews of the Soviet Union, and then a second decision was made in the late summer of 1941 to expand that policy to the rest of the Jews of Europe. With respect to Germany in particular, the even though the beginning of more Jews emigrated from Germany in 1939 than in any other year. And of course, that is very much a consequence of the Kristallnacht. When you look at German Jewish emigration statistics during the 1930s, it's actually surprising to many people that fewer than half of the German Jews had actually left by November 1938. There were many who were planning to leave but hadn't gotten around to it yet. They hadn't organized, sold their property and organized their affairs and so forth. But for a lot of German Jews, and even during much of the year 1938, they could still imagine staying, as bad as things had gotten. Also considering, how difficult it is to pick up and move your life somewhere else, and also considering how difficult it was by that time to go somewhere that you wanted to go. It was hard to go to the United States. It was hard to go to Britain. It was hard to go to Palestine. And, you know, if you're old and you've lived your whole life in the country and so forth, you know the language, okay, you know, the Germans have made this terrible mistake, but I'll stay. So, you know, a continuation of Jewish life was really imaginable in Germany until November 1938. And afterward, the handwriting was on the wall. And so there was massive Jewish emigration from the country in 1939. It even continued into 1940. That is to say, Jewish emigration from Germany was still allowed even as the war was underway. And the official, you know, in the sense of the kind of the consensus motivation behind the anti-Jewish policy of the regime continued to be to push the Jews out and not to kill them. In 1941, that at some point that changes, and the government orders an end to Jewish immigration, and then the actual systematic deportation of German Jews begins in October 1941, and they're deported to, you know, places in Eastern Europe, and in many cases, like, you know, the ones who were deported to Kaunas, you know, to the Baltic, they're shot by Einsatzgruppen, you know, immediately. So, you know, I think the short answer to your question, Jonathan, is 1941. Yeah. But if you want to, go ahead.
Cindy, if you'll permit me, I saw a question come up. What happened to the 12,000 Jews on the border? I actually was just about to ask you that as well. The answer is very instructive, very instructive. Eventually, they were granted permission to come into Poland. They were, after all, Polish Jews. They were Polish citizens. They were kept in a refugee camp for a while, and then they were eventually released. And remarkably, although Herschel died at the hands of the Nazis, his father and his brother survived the war because they reached the part of Poland that was handed over to the Soviet Union when Hitler and Stalin reached an agreement shortly before the beginning of World War II. So they were actually in Soviet territory when the Nazis invaded Poland. Mordechai, one of his older brother, actually served in the Red Army. And to me, this is a very intriguing contrast that the young man who took up arms against the Nazis died. His brother, who also took up arms against the Nazis in the Red Army, survived. And the capper is that at the Eichmann trial, Zindel Grynszpan, Herschel's father, was called as a witness. And Hannah Arendt, when she describes this event, refers to, and she puts it in quotation marks, she refers to Zindel's last name as the famous name. It's famous in quotation marks, but it's another measure of how famous indeed the Grynszpan name was at that time.
Jonathan, I'm sorry, could I ask a question of Jonathan, or we're running out of time?
Well, just sort of along this same theme, if I could just ask a quick question. We've had a lot of questions also about what happened to Herschel's family in Paris, the aunt and uncle that he was staying with.
They were arrested and deported and murdered. The ones who survived were the ones who got into Soviet territory, and eventually found refuge in Palestine, pre-statehood Palestine, after the war, and lived in Israel.
Yeah. Go ahead, Alan.
Sure. So, Jonathan, you mentioned Dorothy Thompson. Just as an aside, I want to point out that Dorothy Thompson lived in Vermont. So, yeah, she was Sinclair Lewis's partner. Yeah, but so she was one of the two world famous people who championed Grynszpan. The other, which I kind of stumbled across as I was researching my subject, I wasn't researching the Grynszpan case so much, but writing it up for context of my study of the Kristallnacht. But I was very surprised to learn as I was doing that the other one who championed Grynszpan was Leon Trotsky.
Indeed.
And I was wondering if you could say something about
Sure,
that.
absolutely. First of all, I think that's a measure of how Grynszpan and the Grynszpan case entered the public conversation. It was so prominent in media that a world historical figure like Trotsky felt moved to comment upon it. He did write about it, and he declared what he called his open moral solidarity with Grynszpan. And I have made a note here. He described that assassination as a convulsive act of despair and vengeance. He says, what's astonishing is that there has only been one Grynszpan. Now, as Alan knows, in fact, 2 years earlier, there had been another assassination of another Nazi, actually in Davos, Switzerland, by another Jewish Avenger named David Frankfurter. And during the buildup, the propaganda buildup against Grynszpan, the Nazis tried to make a case that the similarities in their two assassinations, two Jewish assassins killing Nazi victims, that the parallels between these two cases suggest that it was coordinated by the same international conspiracy. But notably, and this is a quotation as well, Trotsky was a revolutionary socialist or communist. He believed in revolution, and he wrote of the case, not the lone avenger, but only a great revolutionary mass movement can free the oppressed. Now that's his unique point of view. And of course, ironically, he was the victim of an assassination as well. But I think that captures something about this case, that there's something less heroic about a 17-year-old boy who goes into a bureaucrat's office and shoots him, and someone who is part of a movement, part of a guerrilla army or a uniformed army, and takes up the fight in the collective as opposed to as an individual.
So Jonathan, I'd like to, and Alan, I think you can also sort of chime in on this. You've mentioned some reasons why Herschel has been forgotten by history. And I wonder if there's any other ones that you'd like to ask, and sort of from the both of you, how do you think we should remember him now at this point?
Well, I'm going to just say briefly, the whole point of writing the book that I wrote was that I felt it was a mistake and even a tragedy that this compelling and important and unsettling figure was so thoroughly ignored. I don't think he was an unvarnished hero. I think he had a lot of problems as an individual, and I think he poses a lot of problems for collective decision-making in the Jewish world. Is he a model that we really want to embrace? But I think he's a hero of Jewish resistance, and that's why I wrote my book.
I think you can admire his spirit, his determination to not passively accept the victimization of his people and his family, while at the same time kind of questioning his strategic judgment. That is to say that, at the particular moment that he committed his act, it may very well not have been in the interest of the Jewish people to do that, or at least, certainly the Jewish population in France, as Jonathan suggested earlier, the Jewish population in France, didn't want to have anything to do with him. I don't blame him for the Kristallnacht. I saw one of the questions earlier in the chat about, had this assassination not happened, would there have been some other kind of pretext that upon which the Nazi regime would have seized to launch something like the Kristallnacht? And, that's a counterfactual question. It's hard to answer, for certain. it's definitely the case that in the fall of 1938, Hitler and the other top leadership of the Nazi regime felt very frustrated about the slowness with which Jews were leaving Germany, and they wanted, and that frustration had been recently kind of underscored by the failure of the Avion conference in the was it June? I can't remember. Evian conference.
Yeah.
Back in May or June. I can't remember exactly when. You know, after the Munich, you know, Hitler knew by late 1938 that Germany was going to go to war, because he knew that the European powers would not acquiesce in what he wanted to do in Europe. So he knew there was going to be a war. And Hitler subscribed to the anti-Semitic stab in the back theory about why Germany had lost the First World War, because it had been betrayed by Jews and communists and so forth domestically. And therefore he thought that it was a kind of a national security issue for Germany before the next war started to have as many of the Jews as possible out of Germany. So this became the accelerating the departure of Germany's Jews became a very urgent issue for Hitler. So they were thinking about ways to do that. And then, you know, from their point of view, they were kind of fortuitously, they were handed this opportunity by the assassination, which happened 2 days before the 15th anniversary of the beer hall putsch. And so November 9th is actually it's kind of like Good Friday on the Nazi Party's religious calendar, where they commemorate the martyrdom of the Nazis who died in the beer hall putsch in Munich in 1923. And so this kind of this propaganda campaign demonizing Grynszpan and demonizing world Jewry as the puppet masters behind the assassination, and then from Rath actually dying on November 9th, you know, this culminates in this outburst of violence. Hitler authorized it. And one reason, to get back to something Jonathan mentioned earlier, there had been that assassination in Switzerland in 1936 of Wilhelm Gustloff by David Frankfurter. So one needs to ask, why wasn't there a pogrom in 1936 when a very similar assassination had occurred? And the answer was, well, the situation in 1936 was very different than 1938. And the assassination in 1936 happened 2 days before the opening of the Winter Olympics in Bavaria. And with all the foreigners coming for the Olympics, they didn't want to have a pogrom, right? But by November 1938, the whole foreign policy situation, the situation with respect to the Jewish immigration, everything has changed in the meantime. So that explains why in November 1938, Hitler decides to launch a pogrom, whereas in 1936, the government, after the assassination, actually gave very strict instructions that there should be no retaliation against the Jewish community in Germany for that act.
You know, there's another little echo of the Gustloff assassination. In 36, a collective punishment was decreed on the Jewish population of Germany, a fine that would have to be paid as a tax by Jews as a punishment for the assassination of Gustloff. It was not actually collected, but after Kristallnacht, where there was so much damage done in the streets, Goering decided he'd dust that off and impose it now. So the Gustav fine was actually paid by Jews after the von Rath assassination.
And the logic behind that also, I mean, it was supposed to humiliate the Jews and further impoverish them, but it was also designed to reimburse the German insurance industry, which had to basically pay to repair all of those damaged shop windows and damaged businesses and that kind of thing. Because the leaders of the German insurance industry, after the Kristallnacht, decided, they did a lot of international business, and they decided that it would be very bad for their credibility if they didn't honor their policies. And, you know, credibility, you know, the confidence among your customers that the company will actually follow through on its pledges when there's damage, you know, is a very, very important issue for the insurance industry. So Goering has the idea, well, we'll just use the money to basically reimburse the insurance industry for all of that loss.
I also think it helps to explain why the Holocaust took place where it did. The Germans did not want to murder millions of people and deal with all of that problem in their own country. They wanted to do it somewhere else, and they chose Poland to do it, and Russia.
I hate to cut this off, but we are a little bit over time. I could listen to this conversation forever, and we'll definitely have to have a sequel one day. But I want to thank you both so much for being here today. This has been so interesting to listen to, and I've certainly learned so much. And I want to thank you all for tuning in with us today. Everything we do at the museum is made possible through donor support. To those of you watching, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum or becoming a member and joining us for our upcoming programs, which you can check out at the link in the Zoom chat. Have a great afternoon, and thank you all again so much for joining us. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.